So welcome everybody to another Noyo Center for Marine Science Talk. Lovely to see you all and super excited to be diving into something that is, I think, well, for me personally, I'm going to learn a lot tonight because this is an area that even though I've paddled up and down Big River, I remained really, really mystified by estuary ecology. Um, and our center is located on an estuary, and we've got lots of estuaries here. So let's dive into a new area. So I'm going to remind you all, if you are able to kick down $10 for our science talks, these help us continue to bring these great science talks to you all. And thank you all for being members and for supporting the Noyo Center just by showing up and being curious. And most of all, for caring about your coast. I think that's probably the common thread that we all have is that we care deeply about this place that we live in, be it the forest or the estuary or the ocean or the beaches. So we have that in common, and I'm very excited to just know you all and be inspired by you all. So kick down some money for us so we can keep on doing this. And it is an honor here tonight that I introduce you to Edwin Ted Grosholz. Um, and luckily I asked him how to pronounce that because I would have gotten it really wrong. He is a University of California at Davis professor emeritus just as of 2024, and a graduate of UC Berkeley, and a benthic benthic, oh, I knew I was going to get it wrong. Benthic, say it for me, Ted.
Just benthic ecologist, yeah.
Benthic ecologist, great, which means that layer of mud and things that dwell between the top of the water, the bottom of the water, and deep down in there. So, with that part, I'll let him launch into his story tonight and talk about something that I really know very little about. So, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We welcome you and look forward to seeing you and family up here whenever you get a chance. Give us a shout out. And yeah, welcome to the North Coast today.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks for the invitation to talk for everyone and to, I guess, Trey and Peggy for also helping to make this happen. So, and I appreciate you giving me your dinner hour to be able to talk to you. And as I think you'll see is there's a lot of connection and a lot of similarities between what happens in the estuaries, which I know are few and far between in Mendocino, and what happens right offshore. So you'll see quite a bit of parallel with what I'll talk about today and what's happening really on your shores at the moment. So I'm Ted Grosholz, and I'm going to talk about how to restore estuaries, through bringing back one of the really critical native species that we have in this habitat, the Olympia oyster. So you can see a close-up of this. This is the native Olympia oyster, and it's the only indigenous native species of oyster that we have on the West Coast. So what you buy in the grocery store is a great commercial product, but it's not native to this coast. It's the Pacific oyster. It's native to Asia. We brought it over decades ago. Gets bigger and it's the tastier one, if you will. Many think that, but it doesn't create any habitat. It doesn't live on the West Coast. So this is the species that we're interested in bringing back because we want to bring back the entire habitat so that this creates, so not just the oyster itself. Olympia oysters have been really part of Pacific Bays for millennia. You can see this is just a drawn image of Native Americans doing this, but it's clear that we know from other studies that I'm going to push this over and down. This is a little bar you can't see. There we go. This is a view from one of our locations in China Camp. This is Olympia oysters and creating beds that provide habitat for lots of other species. So again, this supports an entire food web. So it's habitat for small fishes and invertebrates. It's a habitat for food for crabs and birds, larger species. It can protect shorelines, especially in the restoration context, and can have positive impacts on water quality if they're small estuaries. So you can see just a view. These are some restoration projects. You can see black oyster catchers and herons. Excuse me. Yeah, instead of great blues, this is just a common. And you can see them here as harvested by Native Americans, for a long time. So there's a lot of information. There's a lot of paleo information in middens and things that Olympia oysters have been eaten for a long time on this coast, not so much in recent years, but certainly historically. And they were the basis of the first commercial aquaculture that we've had on the coast. So we know that they were a fishery, certainly when Europeans showed up for that. There are many places where these are very extensive. These beds can be extremely abundant in places like Washington State and British Columbia. So this is not a view from California, but this gives you an idea of what these beds can look like when the conditions are right. So you can see just many layers of oysters, very similar to what you would see in East Coast oyster beds and oyster reefs. So it's a different species than what people maybe have are familiar with or heard about on the East Coast and the Chesapeake Bay or the Gulf of Mexico, is that, these oysters, our Pacific oysters, don't create 20-foot high reefs, but they will create extensive beds like this. Unfortunately, most of the oysters have really declined and disappeared. So looking to the left of the black bar, you can see that the red dots in California, then up in Washington, these are not all the places that Olympia oysters exist, but they're places where we have data from historic biomass, and we know that the biomass currently is a tiny fraction of what it used to be, probably less than 1%. So what's been happening? Why are oysters in trouble? Well, part of this is their life cycle, which leaves them open to this. This is just a quick view of this, and you can see that male, female oysters spawn. Males release sperm, then the females will develop actually eggs in their body tissue. I'll show you that in just a second. And then, of course, like most marine or many marine animals, they swim around for a period of time before they settle down onto rocks or other substrate. And of course, it's this stage that can be very limiting if there are not enough oysters to spawn. The survival of larvae can be very small. So this is recruitment, or the ability to repopulate, is really what's limiting oysters and many other marine species, unfortunately. Here's a close-up. So those little teeny eggs, so you're looking sort of very, very magnified view, and these are little tiny oysters right along the sort of the opening of the oyster right here. And you can see many, many of them. This is what the larvae look like swimming around. Well, so here's what Olympia oysters and actually many species are kind of up against. So you can see that there's things that are inimical to oysters. You'll see a little bit more of predators. There's snails known as oyster drills, and the snails are like spiders. They'll drill a hole, they'll sort of, and then sort of suck out their prey. So they actually, or these snails will actually create holes in the oysters and eat them. We know that low salinity is really a problem. So as climate change comes along, we have changes in our rainfall. Obviously, we have dry years and wet years. Of course, as most people know, that the future, at least in California, is increasingly dry and increasingly wet, so much more variable years. The low salinity years are particularly difficult for oysters, but they're subject to sediment. They're subject to low oxygen, especially when temperatures are hot, and high air temperatures. Of course, the good things are food supply, so substrate when it's needed. So these are things that we can actually use, especially available substrate, to enhance the Olympia oyster population. But again, it's that critical reproductive phase that really is what needs supporting. This is just a view, and you can see these in your estuaries along the coast. This is the Japanese oyster drill. A little bit different. This is an Eastern oyster drill. So, and these again are non-native oyster consumers, these were actually all brought in the process of trying to establish oysters of different kinds in our estuaries in California. This was brought in with the eastern oysters from Chesapeake Bay. The oysters didn't take, but the drills did perfectly well. The Japanese oyster drill was brought in when Pacific oysters were brought in. The Pacific oysters haven't done particularly well. There are a few places where they're established, but not so well. But again, the snails did quite well. This is the European green crab, which is I can talk quite a bit more about. I will say right now that I know several of you may be interested in the green crabs in your backyard. People have noticed them in crab traps. I can happy to answer questions about those, but they are also an issue for oysters as well. And obviously that originated in Europe, as the name implies. So there's been a lot of studies that have described where and how abundant Olympia oysters are along the West Coast. So we know a fair bit about where they are, and they've assessed some of the things that are threatening the populations I just pointed out, and also the potential for certain populations to be restored. In other words, where we can go in and try to, reestablish, replenish the populations. Um, and again, at many sites, particularly in California, the recruitment, that is the success of juvenile oysters coming and contributing to the population is very limited. So many of the populations that we still have are very threatened and haven't really increased in size over quite a while. So we know that that this is an important part of restoring the population, is to trying to boost the size so that recruitment, the number of babies being produced and the number of juveniles contributing to the population is goes forward. That's really the limiting step in many cases. So this just gives you an idea of this, and I'll just show you one of our sites that I'll talk about. But this is all these 39 different locations along the West Coast, and I'm going to come back to this, but this is the result of a collaborative effort of people up and down the West Coast working on Olympia oysters and been able to sort of, put together this index. The darker triangles are places that are of higher ecological priority in that the populations are really in trouble. So this one here is Elkhorn Slough, which is a National Estuarine Research Reserve site in California. I'll talk about this one, which is here in Tomales Bay, which is just north of San Francisco Bay. And that's another population that's in trouble and needs assistance and needs restoration. So again, this is often due to where recruitment is limited, due to low population sizes, not simply just the not enough oysters to really start to grow the population. These are really good candidates for enhancement using hatchery reared oysters. So you're going to hear quite a lot about the use of aquaculture and hatchery reared oysters to try to boost the populations. So the goal is to use the capacity of aquaculture facilities. So our shellfish growers, we have a number of them on, the West Coast and in California, several in the sort of the north of San Francisco Bay, several in Humboldt Bay. There are many that produce the commercial Pacific oysters, but they also have the capacity to produce the Olympia oysters also. So the goal here is to try to assist restoration by using the sort of the aquaculture capacity of these groups. So here you can see a map, and I'm going to come back to this. This is from the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative, or NOOC. So a little funny acronym, but this is a group of us that literally are restoring oysters in all these different sites. So the graph you saw before was sort of the an assessment of how really in desperate need they are. So restoration is taking place in many or most of those. Whoops. And so what you can see, here's a long list of them. Certainly I won't go over them, but there are plenty of sites in California where efforts to restore native oysters are taking place, and various methods being used for this. So it is a collaborative effort along the West Coast. So this is why to do this. I mean, many of you are thinking, well, is this really necessary? And it's part of a bigger argument or a bigger debate. So aquaculture has historically been viewed as sort of inimical or incompatible with conservation and restoration goals in coastal systems. And we all know stories where, this is the case where, aquaculture has had impacts in different places. Unfortunately, and this is sort of a changing notion within the conservation community generally, is that, the old idea we had was, look, if you just leave them alone, you walk away, they'll get better. They'll recover. And the problem is it's that this old idea doesn't really uh, work anymore. In other words, it just doesn't apply to a lot of species and habitats. We've had extensive habitat loss, climate change, we have biological invasions, aka invasive species. There's been overharvest and other stressors that simply make it so that passive restoration, just sort of standing back and removing the stressors, just doesn't work anymore. We've messed things up badly enough that we have to actively fix them if we want them to persist. Now, this is not a new idea, so we've been doing this in many other systems for quite a while. So restoration aquaculture is, captive breeding by another name. So we've used this to try to, try to, provide or actually just keep things like black-footed ferrets and California condors from just falling off the edge. These were highly threatened species that required this if they were going to persist, and they have. I mean, not all success stories are there. So we know that, say, things like hatchery reared salmon, so that would be sort of aquaculture based, hasn't been dramatically successful. So we know that not every, we still have salmon, but it hasn't resulted in the restoration and creation of sort of viable populations in many of the places that had been hoped. But this is also being used for white abalone. If you've heard or read about this, this is a highly endangered species of abalone found in Southern California and below. That's absolutely, there was no reproduction at all for a long time. And so that's required this sort of aquaculture help. And I'll also talk about bull kelp. This is one that I'll come back to because this is one that's in the process of undergoing restoration here in your backyard. So the approach there is trying different ways of using the hatchery to produce the juvenile stage of sporophytes to sort of then assist the population in regrowing. But of course, as many of you know, there's a lot of other challenges involved in this, but that's a critical approach. So for the oysters, the current approach is to bring adult oysters into the lab, and so the question is to be from where, most likely from the place that you're trying to restore, and spawn many thousands of juvenile oysters. These new juveniles are then sort of settled onto rocks or cobbles or shells, something that can be returned to the original habitat. And so these oysters will then, many thousands of new oysters will contribute to the current population and then also hopefully the production in the next generation in the field. So this is what something like this looks like. You have a hatchery. This is actually the Moss Landing Marine Lab. So this actually is not a commercial hatchery. This is a research hatchery that has been used to produce um, Olympia oysters for restoration in Elkhorn Slough. So Elkhorn Slough, as I mentioned, is a National Estuarine Research Reserve. They were using oysters produced here. What they were doing was settling the little baby oysters on shells and shell strings, so using dried shells as the place for substrate, and then placing those shells back out into the environment, into Elkhorn Slough. And they've been very, very successful on a very small scale with repopulating the Olympia oysters there. The Olympia oysters in Elkhorn Slough were nearly extinct, and so the reserve manager, Kerstin Wasson, had noted there had been no reproduction for probably 5 or 6 years before they started doing this. So they were really on the verge of blinking out. There's a range of different ways in which this restoration can take place. And so part of this is that in many areas, especially in places like California, where we have sort of soft sediment estuaries without a lot of hard substrates, simply putting hard substrate, things like concrete structures, that these concrete structures are actually made of oyster shell. So these are sort of oyster shell based concrete, or putting out cobbles, or putting out sort of other creations, again, partial shell made, or literally putting out shells themselves. So this is from, I think, Washington State. So there are a lot of different ways of approaching restoration in this, a lot of different ways you can undertake this. That's part of what we're doing, is that the best way of doing this is to be determined. So we're still working out the best way of conducting the restoration. It's still a work in progress. So, to draw some parallels with bull kelp and oysters, bull kelp is also limited by recruitment. So, in other words, there's just not enough new reproduction surviving to contribute to the next generation. I mean, we'll see some photos, but of course, where urchin barrens are started, it's very difficult to get recruitment happening there. So, of course, it's being limited by recovery, predation in some cases, consumption by urchins or oyster drills in the case of the Olympia oysters. But of course, climate and conditions are also playing a role. High water temperatures, lack of upwelling really constrain bull kelp. Changing salinity and hypoxia really cause problems for oysters. So they're very similar in that respect. Both of them are using at the moment some type of aquaculture or hatchery production to increase the population. So again, just standing back and waiting for bull kelp or waiting for Olympia oysters to suddenly recover isn't working. Now, there are people in the audience, I know, especially in Fort Bragg and Mendocino, that know this work well. So of course, I'm just preaching to you, but there's a lot of different ways in which people are trying to restore bull kelp by putting propagules on smaller, cobble. They're calling it green gravel, so bits of rock with baby sporlings on them, and or bricks, something like that, or ropes. So these are attached to ropes. So again, there's several different methods being attempted, trying to figure out under what conditions different ones will be more effective. That's often the case, is they can be somewhat site specific. One method will work well in one place and not so much another, but also partly removing, in the case of bull kelp, removing urchins. So hungry urchins, again, released by the sea star die off, and, running out of food because there's no kelp there, are quite out of control. Urchins live an enormously long time, so they're not going to go away by themselves. And so removing urchins is again part of the removal process, or can be one of the tools to be used. So there are a lot of similarities here again. So there's a lot of questions about what's the best method for producing these propagules in the hatchery. How do you go about this? I mean, what's the best way of doing this? I mean, I've seen the propagule production of kelp that's taking place at the Bodega Marine Laboratory to be used for replanting on Mendocino. So, great large tanks with kelp plants, and trying to get sporlings off the ground. And I know this is happening lots of other places too. What are the best methods for outplanting them? I just showed you several examples. And again, this is still one thing that we're trying to figure out, at least for oysters. Ways in which consumers can be controlled. Oyster drill removal can happen by hand, in the same way that people are removing urchins or creating fisheries. So you have some, economic incentive to go out and harvest urchins. Um, but there are other sort of really fundamental questions that are really important for this. So when you're trying to restore a particular location, where do you go to get, the propagule, the brood stock, if you will, to use in the hatchery? Do you get them from the same location? Do you get them from a range of locations, given that climate change is occurring and that temperatures 20 years from now may be a bit warmer than they are at the moment, or there's going to be less upwelling? Um, and should there be some sort of hatchery selection or some sort of conditioning? In other words, should you be trying to, select for more temperature resistant or more, other types of resistance? So there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of approaches that are still being worked out. And the final question is, how can this be scaled up? So even if you figure out how to do this, on some level, not some level, but the best way, or at least in a site-specific way. How do you scale up from just a particular location? As many of you know, if you're involved in kelp restoration or even oyster restoration, it's very difficult to even restore, a small number of really acres or, a small area. So how do you do that across large swaths of the outer coast? Very hard to sort of think about how to scale that up. So I'll mention one project that I'm involved with right now in Marin County and Tomales Bay. This is a location where, for the very first time, we're trying to use restoration aquaculture. So it has been used in Elkhorn Slough, really nowhere else in California. There's a lot of obstacles to doing it. But we've been working now with the Nature Conservancy to undertake this. We're in the process and very close to doing this our first year. We have adult brood stock collected from sites in Tomales Bay, so we've taken sites, throughout a range of it to try to capture as much of the genetic diversity in Tomales Bay as we can. And Bodega Marine Laboratory has produced many, many thousands of juveniles on the little rock cobbles that you see here in the foreground. This is natural rock. You can see this is just falling down from the cliffs. So these are not riprap. This is actually naturally occurring rock, and there's, miles and miles of shorelines like this in Tomales Bay. So we gather the cobbles, bring them into the lab, settle the oysters onto them, put them back out. And so then populations, once we've done this successfully, this is hopefully our first year, will be monitored for growth result, survival and recruitment. And it's part of this larger network that I'll begin to sort of talk with you a bit about. So there's this community of practice that we call it. It's a little bit of a, tough acronym, but it's the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative. And so it's a group of scientists, a whole bunch of you, tribal members, agency folks, shellfish producers. I'll show you the list, all interested in trying to restore this species all along the coast from British Columbia down to Baja California. So it's very much a large network of folks interested in this. And this is a way to scale up. So the question, I just raised a minute ago is, how do you scale up for something like this? Well, of course, one group, one location, you can't do this yourself. So one of the ways of trying to scale up is developing a coordinated community all involved in these kinds of activities. You can think of it as sort of like a crowdsourcing, if you will, of the effort to do this on a larger scale. And I won't bore you with the names here, just sort of showing you there's a lot of organizations and people. See the colors. So this is British Columbia purple, Washington State, follow the arrow, Oregon, California. And we even have a couple down here in Baja California, although it's a bit off the screen. So, with this very extensive network of people concerned and interested in trying to restore this species, and again, the habitat that goes along with it, again, this is restoring really a functional habitat in coastal areas like this. Our planners, practitioners, actually, especially in Washington and British Columbia, Native American and First Nation groups who actually still traditionally use oysters are quite interested in and actually running a lot of this themselves. Oyster growers, so shellfish producers, educators, scientists, funders, and so forth. So there's a whole range of people that are involved in this and contribute to this group. So the elements of this collaboration are involving coast-wide engagement. So we've, done a fair bit to sort of reach out to communities. You could argue this is one of them, but also we have a number of publications. There's a book being produced about oyster restoration in San Francisco Bay that's really, really interesting, really wonderful art, really, really well done. Um, Restoration and conservation, so sort of learning lessons about how to conserve the oysters that are already there and how to restore the population, how to increase the population size. And again, there's been a lot to learn because the sites vary quite a bit from one another. And so different methods work in different places, or just simply different groups try different approaches. So it's very much sort of a trial and error process. there's no book to go to. There's no, experience for something like this. So we really are learning as we go. The use of aquaculture, again, in many of the places that are recruitment limited or that are limited by the number of babies coming into the system, this is really an important part of this. So, and again, there are a lot of issues that I mentioned. So there's a lot of, resistance in some places about using aquaculture. There's concerns about the genetics of the population. There's a number of things that have been shown to be a problem for aquaculture programs in the past. So we certainly understand and are trying to do that better. And then, of course, the science as well. So there's an awful lot of science needed about both basically oyster populations, community oyster, benthic community interactions, the predators, prey, parasites, pathogens, diseases, competitors, mutualists. There are entire food webs out here that determine whether something like an oyster will exist or not. So there's an awful lot of learning about that, about the sort of nearshore processes, local oceanography, a range of land use issues, of course, that determine runoff and stream input. There's a whole host of issues that many of us along the coast are studying and are contributing to this collaboration. This is just one example. I'm not boring you with all the many scientific publications. You can look up my name, and there are many to go along with that. But just to sort of show you a product that we put together for, not just a scientific audience, but for a general oyster restoration audience to be used by any number of folks interested in oyster restoration. So sort of a how-to, our best ideas about how to undertake this in a range of different places. So that sort of collaborative information I mentioned, we've tried to put that together in a single place. In fact, we need probably another one of these now. This one's getting a little bit old at this point. So it is a community of practice. Again, we have, folks like this is Gary Fleener from Hog Island. We have people, scientists from Moss Landing. We've got a range of folks that participate in these kinds of activities, and how they contribute is really important. So many of them are brought in during the restoration process. So it's not just a single group of people starting a restoration program and then saying, well, gee, what do you think? So a lot of people are involved in each of the different steps. In Tomales Bay, this person here, he's got an oyster knife right there. He's been involved very continually through the restoration process in Tomales Bay. So we've relied heavily on some of the commercial growers for assistance, for capacity, lots of different things. Volunteers are really important. So again, a lot of this can be very very labor intensive. This is a shot from Elkhorn Slough, which is again in Monterey Bay, where an awful lot of restoration has taken place. They've really been among the leaders in really trying to push forward different approaches to oyster restoration. Again, this was a site where it was really, Olympia oysters were critically endangered. They were really on the edge of blinking out. And so getting volunteer groups like this to help, move things, get things set up, do counting, monitoring, all sorts of things is really a critical part of this. So this can't happen without community engagement. So we've really worked hard to figure out ways of involving volunteers in doing this. So this is a place where community, people have known it as citizen and community science is really critical. So there are a lot of places where science, sort of scientists, if you will, can't certainly just be the lead and be everywhere at once. So there's been an awful lot of work to involve community and train community scientists so that they can themselves undertake a lot of what's needed for the restoration process. So that's a really critical part. So community science has been absolutely essential for the efforts to restore these populations. And this is, lots of volunteers, lots of students, lots of younger people involved in getting this done as well. So this has been really helpful in lots of places. So to sort of also talk about the website, so this is a place where it provides information. So again, this is this NOOC, the Native Olympia Oyster Collaborative. There we have a great website. You'll see this at the end. You'll see the website. We have lots about Olympia oysters, a lot about their life history, their their life cycles, a lot about their biology. We have restoration, so that's story map that I showed you that had all the different locations is there, so you can learn about exactly what's being done by who and where. So it's a lot of information for each site. Research, so it's a compendium and including a very extensive Zotero bibliography of oyster research. It's an immense contribution. There's a lot of information there on the website about on current research and past research. Teaching, so with materials and ways in which oysters can be discussed and explained in the classroom, including restoration processes. Aquaculture. So in the sites, aquaculture is not needed at every site, but some sites it's really critically needed. So that's part of what the Nook website tried to explain. And then, of course, describing all the people along the West Coast, again, from Canada down to Mexico. We have sort of customizable brochures, things like that. So information that people can just go to, download, get themselves, pass out, hand out, share. And again, this is the story map. I decided not to sort of do this online because it might cause issues or connectivity issues. But again, you can click on any one of these little dots, learn a lot about the restoration and what's been going on, what's been happening. So I want to also sort of call out many of the organizations that have really been important at this Pew Charitable Trust, but they've been putting together a program called SOAR with the Nature Conservancy. This is a program that began sort of during, at least out here where we are, during COVID. So it was a way of engaging um, growers, shellfish growers in the restoration process because, during COVID, obviously everyone was suffering. Shellfish growers were producing oysters, but no one was coming around to oyster, bars. No one was going out. No one was purchasing them. So we put to use and provided funding for them to help produce Olympia oysters for restoration processes. So they've done a great job of engaging local tribes, even where we are in Tomales Bay, the Grayton Rancheria, but Elkhorn Slough has involved the Amamudsen tribe extensively. They've been a big collaborator. They're actually undertaking some of their own activities these days also. So growers, various local and national conservation groups to expand aquaculture in these priority areas that we're interested in. So again, these groups get a real call out for helping make this happen. Okay, so I did want to sort of show you this website. So here's the resources on the web. So you can contact us at olympiaoysters@gmail to get updates. Again, you can get to the story maps, you can get to all the information. This is a really great place to find out more about this. Okay, well, I hope I have provided some new views of this, not offended anyone, and just provided some insights into the processes happening, if not in your backyard, an estuary is very close to where you are. So I think what I'll do is probably stop there, and I'll probably stop sharing at this point. And I'll look to take questions, and I think I'm going to look to Sarah, I think, who's going to try to manage this, I suppose.
Muted. There we go. Great information and hopeful and inspiring for sure. And I'm sure, yeah, right in the middle of the talk, people who live on estuary and type places are asking, first of all, is there historic evidence of the Olympia oyster in Mendocino County? And do we have the right habitat for them to be viable now? So I guess that's broad because just in my mind, each location is so different. But
It's a good question. I'm not, unfortunately not a paleoanthropologist. So what people usually do is they look around for things like shell middens. And so that's been done extensively at a number of sites. And unfortunately, I don't know the answer for Mendocino County. I could probably look into it, but um, John Erlinson, who's a very well-known paleoanthroperson at the University of Oregon, has looked extensively up and down California at shell middens for various species. I could go back and look. So my guess is uh, people may have an answer, and I just don't know what the answer is. But that's the best way for to see how, how extensively oysters were there and whether they were used as food by local populations. So.
Interesting. Maybe we can get his name again. Um,
Oh yeah, John Erlandson. It's Erlandson, Erlandson.
Perfect.
And again, these can be determined by taking sediment cores. That's quite an extensive process. These would be sort of like probably boat based, like 6 to 10 foot cores that go way down and checking, looking at sediments, dating the sediments, using, lead, stable isotopes and things like that. So you could look at the age of sediments and say Noyo Harbor or elsewhere, Big River, and see if there are oysters there.
Perfect.
Pardon me, again, I'm suffering a little bit from local allergies, so
Well,
sorry.
you drink your water and rest your voice for a minute, and I'll get to some of these questions here. What is the role of the Olympic oyster in the environment?
Mhm.
Yeah, just I know you touched on
Yeah, I can
the
probably repeat that. So, yeah, the Olympia oysters create the sort of shell matrix, so where their normal abundance, and that sort of creates a habitat or a refuge for all sorts of little things, little invertebrates, small fishes. It's like little cracks and crevices for them to live in, which then provide food for bigger species that come over and start picking up, the things out of that. So bigger fishes, shorebirds will come around and low tide and poke things out, barred crabs and other kinds of consumers. So it creates sort of a food basis, if you will, a base of the food web for lots of other species. So it creates its own habitat and brings along a lot of other species with it. So that's kind of its function. The oyster itself does things like filters phytoplankton out of the water. So it will, in some cases, sort of, if you will, it's got to be a very limited place. It can clarify the water, it can sort of clear it up a bit, but you need a fair number of oysters relative to the water for that. But its own function is as a filter feeder. So there are a lot of species that are filter feeders. It is a filter feeder. It takes the phytoplankton, and that's kind of its food. So, yeah.
nice. And then Lydia says, thank you for your talk. Are there any opportunities for community engagement outside the Elkhorn Slough? I mean, I just already get excited about this community and how, people showed up in droves just to feed our urchins cabbage when we were trying to just do the food trials and things like that. So we've got a community that likes to get involved and learn. So your website looks very user friendly. Uh,
So this was with the urchins, feeding the urchins, trying to bulk them up.
right, it sounds really backwards, but our
Yeah.
aquaculture project was to, yeah, bulk them up and then make them a food
Make them.
desirable,
Yeah, yeah.
fishery desirable commodity or fisheries item.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Monique is saying, once restored, are the populations staying stable or are they growing?
Yeah, so we've been growing populations on small scales in a few locations. Yes, so they've done well. The good news for the Elkhorn Slough, which was the one I kept saying was the really desperate population, and where they have been actually putting aquaculture oysters in, the recruitment has really, really taken off. So that, I mean, it's a little shocking. And some of us are like, well, let's see, let's wait a couple more years and see if it's just sort of like a natural spike. But they started doing really well. So we're hoping that that's really truly a response to the human efforts But yeah, I would say that a couple places it's really helped to stabilize, but we are still, at least in California, at the very sort of first years of this. Washington State has a better track record for that, and they have had more success, but they've been going at it for a much longer period of time, and they've had many more people involved. So yeah, if that's the place to look and to ask the question of whoever you're asking the question of, AI, or whether you're asking a local expert, whether and to what degree it's been successful, because they've been doing it for long enough that we kind of have a good idea. It's a good
That's
question. So ask me in 5 years when we're doing ours. So
right. Yeah, I mean that's key, I guess, to wonder like, is it because they have more people or is it because of their unique substrates and
mhm.
how the estuaries are. Yeah, I remember in oceanography, that was the first thing. Like Big River is going to be different salinity, different temperature, different flow, different everything every single hour of the day. And
Right.
then some. So it was just like,
Yeah, they change. I mean, they are quite a bit more changing than, say, the areas off the coast. Although, because of upwelling and all sorts of other processes, wind-driven processes. I mean, even the coastal areas off of your coast, the open ocean can still be really, quite variable from location to location. So, yeah.
absolutely, yeah. And then Misha, our intern, is asking, is aquaculture happening at all restoration sites? And do you think aquaculture is essential for ongoing efforts to sustain the Olympic
Um,
oyster population?
Yeah, it's not happening everywhere, nor should it, and especially their populations in the Northwest. I mean, Washington, not really so much Oregon, Washington really, and British Columbia, where they're really it's Puget Sound, where they're really, really extensive populations, and they don't need restoration. What they need is just sort of conservation to provide, to prevent overharvest and habitat loss, so just dredging up the areas and turning them into something. There are many places, especially in California, where the populations are very limited and very low. And so those do, require, not to say require, but if we want to keep the populations intact, they will need aquaculture restoration. So aquaculture is only a part of it for the more threatened locations. Unfortunately, many of those are in California. So yeah, so not all restoration involves aquaculture. What I showed you, I think, was a couple of those sort of structural examples, rocks and those funny looking concrete things. There are many places where, well-known places, San Francisco Bay, San Diego Bay, even in Eureka, where additional hard substrate. In other words, places for oysters to settle. They don't like settling just on goopy mud. They'll get covered. Is enough. In other words, just restoration can involve providing new substrate, new cobbles and rocks and bits for them to settle. So that will increase the population size. So no aquaculture needed, just substrate provision is what's required.
Right, right. Yeah, I wonder like as Big River becomes less silted from the historic logging siltation of that, of all of these river mouths.
Mhm.
Slash estuaries. Now I'm wondering if I know what I'm talking about when I talk about estuary.
Sure.
But just like, well, why doesn't Big River have a ton of them over there on the south bank?
They may have. I mean, you identified sort of land use issues that tend to heavily impact estuaries. So if there was extensive logging and, siltation, due to that input, that could very well have covered them. We know that some of the places that I work in Central California, in Tomales Bay and Bodega Bay and the Elkhorn Slough, these are places that have just gotten massively silted in. So San Francisco Bay is, of course, famous for, the sort of mining practices up in the foothills that basically, use hydro mining, just basically washed, prop millions of cubic yards of sediment down into the substrate and filled San Francisco Bay with all kinds of goop and of course covered everything. But sort of we'll say land use practices in Tomales Bay, overgrazing, other things contributed to enormous inputs of silt. So in a place like Big River, if those practices have now been attenuated. In other words, if logging isn't happening to the same degree, that silt over time will make its way out. So you probably will see, the emergence, if you will, of more hard substrate. I haven't been to that, I haven't seen it, but you said that South Shore. If there are hard substrates below that silt, yeah, that may, they may be able to recolonize a bit if they're there. So, but again, I don't know the history right there of whether oysters were there and that sort of thing. So
Cool to wonder. Let's see. And Peggy is asking, when brought into the lab, are the oysters introduced to spawn? And if so, how? Or how do you wait for it to happen? Are you
yeah,
tickling
no,
something?
that's a really great question. So you can wait, but we usually bring them in and then sort of warm them up a bit and feed them a bit. So if you kind of encourage them by sort of making them fat and happy, then they'll often spawn kind of on a bit of a schedule. The idea is that you would like to sort of know when all these babies are being produced so you can get whatever it is you're hoping to settle them on ready. So you kind of get everything set up, bring the oysters in, and then you hopefully trigger them with slightly, warmer water and higher food levels. So yeah, so that there is a little bit of tricking them into this. So
Uh-huh. And then Gabrielle Levine, who lives on the Albion, um, and does pay great attention to that little estuary, and works tirelessly on keeping it eating by even eating green crabs, I've heard. Is oyster restoration working in any places with a lot of green crab?
yeah, well, I know all about green crab. I've spent quite a bit of my scientific career working on what to do about them and their impact. So, um, with the adult oysters, they're not likely to have a big impact. They're likely to have much bigger impact on the smaller ones as if they
Mhm.
get established. So,
Yeah.
um, yes, good job keeping the green crabs down. It's going to be a labor of love. They're not going to go away. They're going to continue to come back. But keeping the numbers down is a great plan and a doable plan. So, um, there was a question about, was that the person asking about wood in the estuary?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yes, they will settle on wood. We've seen them on all kinds of trees and roots and things. So as long as it's a hard substrate, they'll use that. In fact, there are a couple places where people are doing restoration using available logs and things like that. So they're actually been dragging around, what the river people call coarse woody debris and using the coarse woody debris as a substrate for, oyster settlement. So yeah, it can be very valuable, but probably need to anchor it so it's not going to roll around and float around. But some anchored wood would certainly be good substrate. Yeah.
Cool. And then Misha again is just, do you anticipate any future challenges to the Olympia oyster restoration? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The good news is that Olympia oysters don't suffer from oyster diseases that some of the others do. So if you may have heard of, you know, people in oyster production areas in Humboldt and others worrying about sort of the new oyster disease, which is called Australian herpes virus, and people are
um,
really panicked about this. The good news is that Olympia oysters are an entirely different family of oyster, if you will. So they tend not to be very affected by disease. That's really they're not very resilient to low salinity in some of the ways the other oysters are, but they're not prone to a lot of the diseases. However, with that said, we still have, challenges based on climate change. And of course, climate change is always the uncertain factor. In estuaries, of course, the big issue there is what is the impact on um, outflow, like river running, and of course the salinity that follows that. And I did mention that earlier, but the downscaled climate models do seem to indicate that throughout much or most of California, that we're going to continue to see greater variability in rainfall interannual. So some years will be really hugely wet, and other years will be very, very dry. So we're going to see the difference between wet and dry increasing, many, many more wet years, many, many more drier years. And the wet years are the ones that are particularly difficult for Olympia oysters because they're not very resistant to low salinity. So in places where you're going to get a big, huge river flush for more than a week or so, that could have a bad impact. So that's one of the things that we're concerned with going forward. Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah, that really speaks to our estuary, and that Jamie was here, and she was a Sea Grant fellow and did do the other type of oysters within the Noyo.
Mhm.
And she did urchins and abalone as well. And those oysters did handle the fluctuation in salinity
Yeah.
and handled that big outflow just fine. But it sounds like that's probably a big reason why we might not be able to have them.
Yeah, that is a limit. So it depends on, how one of the things is how long that salinity, the low salinity lasts. If it's a big river that sort of flushes out quickly in a matter of a few days or weeks, excuse me, a few days and not weeks, then that's a place where the oysters can live and still thrive. I mean, they can sort of, the expression goes, clam up. They can basically sort of tough out low salinity for probably a week or so. We've actually done that kind of work in the lab, but if it goes a lot longer than that, then they can't. And so where we are in Central California, we have these big rivers that come into San Francisco Bay, and when you have a rainy year, those rivers will run for weeks and weeks, like a month or two. So you'll have low salinities for a very long period of time, but smaller rivers coming into sort of more limited estuaries, they may just flush themselves out quickly enough that it won't be a long-term problem, but to be determined. So
To be determined.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
And then one more question from Gabrielle. Are living Olympic oysters available commercially?
Yes, they are. So that's a good one too. So up in Washington State, they are a commercially produced oyster, just with the Pacific oysters. Again, they're smaller. I like them. I think they're fine. I mean, some people they have a distinctive taste, if you will. But if you go to the sort of the fancy oyster bars in different places in big cities in Portland and San Francisco and so forth, people want a range of oysters. I mean, they want an oyster palette that has, five different species from different places from Europe and East Coast and so forth. So they are kind of, people say a value added oyster, but they are just a smaller oyster. If anyone goes to grocery stores here in the US, I mean, I can go to my grocery store and see something called the Kumamoto oyster. I mean, you can get like the Pacifics and then you get the littler ones. They're called Kumamotos. They're produced commercially. They're about the same size as Olympia oysters. So Olympia oysters, they don't get big, but neither do the Kumamoto. So it's pretty clear you can sell and eat a smaller oyster. So we're trying to figure out a way in which we can get the commercial producers to help us grow Olympia oysters. Now, let's think about this way. If they grow a batch of Olympia oysters, hopefully they can sell some and then hand off the rest to us for, restoration. So we're trying to sort of figure out a way of bringing along commercial interest in order to use their capacity to really help bail out the Olympia oyster. So the fact that it can be a market is a beneficial thing. So
For sure. That's awesome. I mean, that's kind of, it reminds me of the purple urchin. Um, I love the purple urchin. I think it's sweet. It's the perfect size if you're a little bit squeamish, like a big oyster compared to a small oyster, like the big urchin uni chunk compared to the little uni that is so
Mhm.
sweet. I kind of like that. So
So you
super.
don't like red urchins, I guess. No. Okay.
I, I don't like red urchins too much, but I love purple urchins. But of course, you got a Brazil nut compared to a little pistachio, and
Right.
it's hard to process them. But
So a
yeah.
question back to you. So people are still now harvesting purple urchins for, essentially restoration purposes. There's not really a market for them at this point, is there? Well,
Uh, yeah, not gangbusters. No, I think that they're not viable in terms of just processing. And so and they're the ones subtitly I understand are the really, really empty ones. There's this little strip in kind of almost where the waves are, where there is algae and there are purple urchins that are fat and sweet. But anything further out is just
Well, they're
empty.
starving because, yeah, the lack of
Mhm.
the kelp
Yeah, the
disappeared. Yeah.
overpopulated.
Yeah. And so people may remember, especially, I'm sure there's a few older folks in this group I can see, can remember in the 80s when urchins were the #1 fishery in California. For a number of years, they were the biggest fishery. We had divers out there with hookahs just bagging them up as fast as they could. And they went down quite a bit. I mean, the populations went down, and then people moved on to sea cucumbers. If you mean sea cucumbers were the fishery that followed that. So we've had this sort of pattern of using them. But, it's interesting to sort of look back. It wasn't that long ago where they were so abundant, they were just a fishery. So, a top fishery. So,
For sure. And that's a lot of the people that are working on the purple urchin, the restoration kelp forest, are those out of work red urchin harvesters
yeah, yeah.
and people that remember that. So yeah, and they're still coming in, and there are a couple places. I think somebody might correct me if I'm wrong. I think there are some local buying of purples, I think, and then our whole idea is to just fatten them up and make them delicious and sell
Mhm,
them. And we've had great success at our fundraisers serving them up and beautifully presented
mhm.
purple urchins, and they are really delicious. So, and you're
Well, I'm going to take it upon myself to follow up and see what I can find out about the history of Olympia oysters anywhere in this area. So, yeah,
That'd be really interesting. Yeah,
I'd
now
be
I'm
curious.
gonna try to look for them.
So yeah, I'd be happy to sort of bring some up to the Albion River and get them established. I mean, it's a
Oh,
native
oh,
species.
oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I've done all the investigation and looked in the middens and looked on the pilings and I can't find any, but it seems like they should be here.
Hmm. Well,
And
I mean, I would admit I couldn't do this either, but I mean, unless you yourself, you might be paleoanthropologist. I mean, it might be worth getting, someone that actually has real expertise in how to go through middens and what to look for, and maybe some, uh, chemical tools to look a little
yeah,
bit more closely and see what there is there. But it would be, I'm glad that you've been very interested in looking for that. And if I find something out, I'll be happy to get back to you. I guess that was Gabrielle that I saw.
yeah, let's get each other's contact.
Yeah.
And I think you're at the end of your talk, but I would love to hear eh, any advice you have or hope for the future with the invasive green crab. I think they have just finished eating up all of our beautiful eelgrass beds.
Oh, well, that could be partly, yeah. I mean, that is one of the things that they can have a big impact on. My guess is that there are probably other factors contributing to that. But yeah, they can, depending on the abundance. So was this a very, very big year for them in your estimation?
Um, Albion used to be the biggest eelgrass bed between Bodega Bay and Humboldt Bay, and
Hmm.
in the last 3 years, it's gone down to almost zero. And there have been infinity green crabs for the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years.
And has
And
anybody, I mean, has anyone been out there putting numbers on this and the study?
nope, the last Fishing and Wildlife survey for the eelgrass was a good year, and they found that we were doing fantastic.
Hmm.
But they haven't been back
That's
since.
been
That was, yeah, that
5 years ago.
4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I've been, and that's exactly what I'm looking for is how to get awareness and get someone to come back and help us document this. I understand the eelgrass beds are declining everywhere, so it's not just
Yeah.
us, but I'm sitting here watching it and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, so it would be really important. I've got a colleague who's looking at eelgrass around my area. I mean, again, I wasn't something I focused on myself, and again, I'm retired, so I'm not picking up new stray
So
projects.
am I, so, so I have time
Yes, yeah,
for it.
but
Yeah,
I'll mention this to him, and
okay.
see what he
And
says.
and I can offer a place to stay for anyone who wants to come up and look at eelgrass or green crab
Mhm.
or oysters. And Sarah can get you my contact information.
Sure. Yeah, and
Well,
also reducing numbers of green crabs is very difficult. So yeah,
It's I know, and we're getting nowhere. We do. I tell all the Dungeness crabbers to eat them, but I don't think it's making any
well, so
impact.
think about it this way. Think about it as bait. In other words, you can use them for bait for sort of,
Yep.
the other crab traps. I mean, that's what
Yep.
many cars do. Yeah, yeah.
Yep. And we need more river otters, more sea otters. We have decent river otters, but we need more sea otters. I think that's the only answer I can think of, like Elkhorn Slough did.
Yeah, no, that was Well, they didn't do that. The sea otters did that themselves. I
Well,
mean,
that's what I mean. Get the sea
yeah,
otter, help the sea otters and let them do the work.
yeah. Unfortunately, that's a very unusual
Yep.
situation to have sea otters sort of resident in an estuary. It's really, really, yeah, hard. That's not going to happen. Unfortunately, I wish it would, but yeah. Okay, well,
Good.
good luck. Okay, so
Thank you.
yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And yes, Ernest, she is talking about Albion, the Albion there. Yeah. Well, we'll let you get your voice taken
Great.
care of.
Thank you very
And
much. Yep. Okay.
thank you so much for being our guest. And please look us up. Um,
Well, good luck. I'm impressed about the community that supports the center, so I hope that continues too. So good luck with that.
oh, thank you so much. It
Okay.
was nice to meet you. And
Yep.
give us a shout out when you're in town.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'll do that. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks
Yep.
so much. Good night.